questionable as to whether or not it's the 142 training center that is in essence certifying to the training, or it's the air carrier that is certifying to the training. That's for something else. This is where independent contractors present themselves to the FAA as saying, I've been trained because I was trained at this 142 training center. Questions? Thoughts? Next question.
Ray Meltzer, Farmingdale, Fisdale. What if an owner has his aircraft on a 135 certificate, and he's a pilot himself and qualified. He brings his own crew, and he wants to take the aircraft for a couple of days. There's no written agreement between him and the 135 operator, no pay and no possession agreement. At the time he grabs the aircraft is airworthy. He takes it for a couple of days and a violation occurs, an airworthiness violation, for example. Who's responsible? Who has operational control? Who gets violated, the owner or the operator or both?
In that case, if it truly is the owner that's taken the aircraft and has operational control, it would be just the owner. But as I was saying before, this is a very good area to make sure that you write down, and it is very clear who has operational control in what cases, because the owner may claim that really it was the operator that had operational control. So as an operator, you would want to have something in writing to say, this is when we're going to have it Part 91, this is when the owner is going to have operational control, this is when the operator, have operational control. And I would, if I was an operator, I would want to make it very clear when it is that the owner has operational control.
But in this case, there was no agreement, so it leaves a real dilemma for the inspector.
When you say no agreement, you're saying nothing in writing. There could be oral agreements, and that too is an agreement. But I'd like to add two things. One of the things that we've observed is that in the situation that you're talking about, and maybe not so often when the owner is not a pilot, but when an owner is advised of what operational control is comprised of and the responsibility and liability he may entail, many of these owners say, well, even when the aircraft is being used for my own use, it's going to be a 135 flight. We've had a lot of situations like that. The other thing I want to stress is that in the scenario you painted, where the owner took the aircraft, whether or not there's an airworthiness violation when he has it, before the air carrier can then take the aircraft and use it in 135 operations, they have to do some type of conformity check, and it depends on the extent of time the aircraft has been away, I guess a number of hours, etc., to ensure that that aircraft meets the 135 requirements and is being maintained under its maintenance program. So you can't forget that either.
Other questions?
No.
Okay. Back to Ken.
All right. Notice I say a lot. Anyway. What about using the owner's pilots? Did everyone get the distinction, and this was a fine distinction, that an illegal wet lease involved use of an aircraft and providing an air crew? Because in essence, we didn't make it illegal for the owner's pilots to operate the aircraft. We put certain conditions on the use. That was a very difficult area for us to sort out. It obviously would have been easier for us to simply say that any time an aircraft owner's pilot, or just simply prohibit aircraft owner pilots from operating an individual aircraft, operating the owner's aircraft. The task was to try to draw a fine line on this area. It is sometimes difficult to I don't want to say necessarily comprehend, but at least to see what's actually going on. And that's why it's important to not only look at these agreements, we recommend a separate agreement so that the operator is not under any obligation to use the pilots being provided by the aircraft owner. Okay. Right. Yeah, and so, because that does in fact happen, and many, many times as such, and it may in fact look like an illegal wet lease. You cannot allow an illegal wet lease to occur. All right. Of course, let's see, we talked about the independent contractors. This next section talks methods for exercising operational control. And this section was included because at the time, AFS 250 felt that inspectors needed some real-life experiences, or examples, I should say, not real-life experiences, examples of how you would go about exercising operational control. And they came up with various examples because 135, let's face it, there's basic 135, single pilot, single PIC. Clearly, today's 135 operators operate internationally, domestically, to remote areas. Some of their shifts and all are, especially in the EMS or the air ambulance area, is, I guess I'm the only one in the room who forgot to turn off their cell phone. I hear my cell phone going off over there. So the thing is that the complexity associated with 135 does make this difficult for inspectors to adequately address. The OPSPEC per se is written for, and the 121 folks will be getting their version of A008, but the one that you have in front of you is basically written for an on-demand operator that's operating 2, 3, 4 aircraft that is not a single pilot, single PIC, or basic 135. They will have their own version of A008. It's basically for the, when I say the typical 135, somebody who may operate turbine-powered aircraft, have 2 or 3 of these, at least 2 or 3 aircraft on their certificate, may operate domestically, internationally, to remote areas, maybe an air ambulance, so forth and so on. Anyway, some of the other things, let's move on. All right. If we don't say operational control at least 582 times, we have not completed this briefing. We're up to 112 if you've been keeping count. Everybody know what operational control means. We also see, again, this idea in 135.77, the responsibility for operational control. I emphasize that it says each certificate holder, not the pilot, is responsible for operational control and shall list in its manual required by 130.21. Obviously, basic folks, single pilots aren't required manuals. Hence, there are some difficulties in this area as to who is actually, may or may not be difficulties in trying to determine a single pilot, single PIC, or basic 135 who's operating the aircraft. All right. Also, you'll notice in 135.23 that it talks about these manual contents, and one of the requirements is the person's duties, responsibilities, and authority, and the name and title of each person authorized to exercise operational control. This idea of duties, responsibilities, and authority becomes important because what we have observed are indications where, say, the director of operations is outflying the aircraft. It's not unusual for many of these management officials, especially the chief pilot and director of ops, to be active line pilots as such, and they have delegated their duty, authority, responsibility. Can you delegate responsibility? Can you delegate authority? Whatever. They have designated some individual within the company to perform certain things like designating the pilots, taking weight and balance documents, ascertaining the airworthiness of an aircraft. These people are not qualified to do that, and they have not been listed in the certificate holder's manual in order to accomplish that. you will see the management official requirement for this area, once again, in the OPSPEC about who can or cannot exercise control within the carrier and how many times, so to speak. In other words, if I authorize as Director of Operations Alan to act in my behalf, can Alan then turn around and designate Doug to act in Alan's behalf to exercise operational control? The answer is no. So, as the slide says, the following examples are provided to illustrate the range of the configurations of operational control systems, and I underline the word systems. And clearly, we're taking these slides, assume, I hate to use the word assume, that there are no other impediments to the free exercise of operational control. So what are those? The remotely sighted or satellite operations. That typically we see a lot of satellite operations. We see where aircraft are located far away from main base of operations. They may be located at a hospital. They may be located on an oil derrick. They may be located at many different areas where operational control becomes extremely difficult. So, as Hooper says in his slides here, the primary driver to configuration is the ability to communicate between the operator and the crew. Yes, communication is important. Communication allows for knowledge. It must be prescribed. Everyone must know what is going to happen before it's going to happen, not after it happens. We got to know who the pilot's going to be. We have to know if the pilot is qualified, if the aircraft is airworthy, things like that. And of course, where is all this spelled out? It's in the GOM under the duties, responsibilities, and authorities. It goes back to this idea of those three important areas. All right, what is a responsibility? Something a person is accountable for. Well, you'll see, again, we try to make it absolutely clear who is accountable for the actions of their employees. Guess who? It's a certificate. We also talk about what an authority is. That's a power that a person is invested with to accomplish something. Of course, a duty is a task or a function that you have to do. In the first example, and again, we're trying to give some examples of the different kinds of operations and how difficult operational control may in fact be to apply. The first one is an aircraft, I believe, that's going from Wilmington over to France. And in this case, when you look at the initiation, the conduct, and the termination, the operational control of the flight, you notice that there are certain areas where, for example, the operator is assigning the crew and the aircraft for a specific flight. Who's attesting to whether or not the flight can even be conducted within the OPSPECs? Of course, this is the operator. And then while the flight is actually being conducted, the sense is that the crew is responsible for possible return or diversion if it's required in flight, but who actually is aware of and who has set out the parameters for when this will necessarily take place, when it will and when it won't take place as such. Now, I'm not talking about an emergency procedure. The engine's on fire, the pilot has to make a decision about landing the aircraft. We're talking about possible diversion where the passenger may ask to go to a different destination than originally designed. This is where, if you were listening in Doug's presentation, operational control does not involve whether or not the passenger says, oh, I don't want to go from here, I want to go from there. That is merely a request. The actual operational control or the exercise of operational control comes from when it is actually authorized by the certificate holder to make that change. That becomes difficult, especially when the aircraft is airborne away from the main base. Now, in some very sophisticated 135 operations that I have reviewed, these folks have satellite communications. They can get any aircraft at any time. And let's face it, it's just a good business practice to know where the aircraft are located and the status of those aircraft. In this case, as it says, management exercises all operational control until departure, then the crew is authorized as its agent. And I don't want to necessarily say, I don't want any confusion here where it says exercises operational control as the agent. They are now acting as the agent for the certificate holder. As you read the specs, the certificate holder is responsible for the actions or inactions of their agents. Anyway, then the flight crew becomes the agent for the certificate holder. Flight takes place, flight goes on. Another example is a domestic operation where, because of the area of operations, the kinds of operations, even the weather, as it's pointed out here, are driven by op specs, and the operator has to then apply those op specs to the limitations contained in them to the actual operation. For example, the pilot may request to go to an airport that the operator may or may not be authorized due to performance-related issues or because of the kind of approach that would be authorized in there. Now, there's no question that the pilot may be able to actually fly the approach. The question is the carrier authorized to be able to fly that approach? It isn't whether or not the pilot can do it, it's whether or not the carrier. So the carrier has to impart this information to the pilot as their agent, saying, for example, we are not authorized Category 2 operations. You may not conduct any, if you have to go to an airport where it requires Category 2 minimum, you are not authorized to do that. Certainly the pilot can fly. The pilot may have even been trained to conduct Category 2, but because the operator is controlling the flight, the operator is in fact spelling out the requirements to the pilot in command, saying this is what any limitations, concerns that I necessarily have. So again, the operator assigns the pilot or for a particular flight or series of flights, and the pilot applies those op specs, obviously the company procedure and the company procedures in planning that flight. This becomes important because, again, when I've looked over some of the training programs of the certificate holders, that there's usually some sort of 1 or 2 hour basic indoctrination of the air carrier involved. They come, the pilot, typically air crew come already qualified, either from another certificate holder or been trained in 142, whatever. And in the process, the carrier then imparts the requirements and limitations of that particular operator to the pilot in command. This is why it's important that the pilot in command, that the operator have some sort of leverage over the pilot in command, over its flight crews. If, as we have been told, that pilots are not listening to the operators because, after all, you don't pay me, I don't work for you, I'm going to do whatever that aircraft owner tells me to do. After all, that's the person who pays me, that's the person I have loyalty to, that's the person who has a lot of leverage. The question is, as you have heard over and over again, a non-certificate holder cannot be affecting or making any sort of decisions, operational control decisions about the operation or conduct of that flight. One, just as a sideline, another area that seemed to be confusing to a lot of folks was the fact that they always believed that if the owner was on the aircraft, it was automatically a Part 91 flight. Have we dispelled that rumor? You understand that just because the owner is on board the aircraft, it is not automatically, or a representative of the owner. I've seen owners' children, spouses, friends, and whatever on the aircraft, and some document will say this is a 91 flight. It isn't automatically a 91 flight or flights being conducted on Part 91 just because a representative of the owner is on board the aircraft. In fact, there are many flights where owners are on board the aircraft where it should be conducted under Part 135. I'm not referring to 91501 or any of the flights associated with 91501, which has its own set of issues, problems, questions. Rather, I'm talking about the idea that you don't automatically assume that if the owner's on board the airplane, it's a 91 flight. Anyway, So this flight takes off. I think he's going from Mobile to Austin to Houston. BTR, Baton Rouge? Back to Mobile. And in this case, a pilot is certainly, again, responsible for the return or diversion if required. Pilot makes those kinds of decisions acting on behalf of the, as the agent of the certificate holder. Pilot reports when they land, they talk about any changes to the itinerary to the certificate holder. And then if, as it says, if changes are made, the pilot reports that the operator plans and executes the new flight. Again, management exercises operational control of the flight when changes are made to the itinerary because communications are available. Even if communications are not available, I want to stress that that does not preclude the fact we were up in Alaska, and a lot of folks in Alaska apparently can't talk to each other because they don't have communications to some of these outlying areas. But we'll talk about that here in just a second. That does not preclude the exercise of operational control by the certificate holder over its operations. This was another, and I think Hooper was kind of getting at the operational control area of this remote area site, and this happens to be, I can't remember, was this the float plane up in Alaska? I think it's a lake up in Alaska.
Yeah.
And in this case, once again, the operator determines, due to the area of operations, the kind of operation, weather, whatever, is being applied by the operator and accepting the flight request. The pilot is not doing that on behalf of the certificate holder. Clearly, it is the certificate holder. Again, the operator assigns the pilot, and now is assigning a pilot to a series of flights, not individual flights. Of course, the flight is a takeoff and landing. And a question came up about, well, how many flights or series of flights could this take place, or how could we release or authorize, say, 50 flights or a year's worth of flights? Could the certificate holder do that? As you will read later in the op specs, we leave this area open as to whether or not they want to release all flights, a series of flights, and to put various parameters on what flights they will release and those they will not. And in talking with some of the operators, most of them have said, we're going to we're going to control all of the flights, even the 91 flights. We are going to control them. We will have knowledge of those flights. After all, the airplane has to be maintained under 135 at all times anyway, either under a maintenance program, inspection program, whatever. So the knowledge of what is happening to that aircraft and those pilots, let's face it, even under Part 91, that is other commercial flying, must be accounted for. It's not free time. If those pilots return to commercial flying, all that time that they've flown under 91 must be considered in any subsequent commercial flying. It is considered other commercial flying. So the pilots must maintain a log, or the certificate holder must know the amount of other commercial flying of Part 91 flying pilots are accomplishing. Typically it comes up in the tail-end ferry issue. Well, tail-end ferry, that's 91, doesn't count. All I can say to that is all flying necessarily counts. It's just when it's applied. The 91 flight time may in fact be a limitation, say, to the next day's flying. But that's for the flight duty presentation. I just want to emphasize that there is a section in the op spec that we said at one time, I think we're up to our 16th or 17th revision of this document, that we said that at any time the airplane's, a question of the airplane's airworthiness, in other words, an owner operated the aircraft and did not impart information back to the certificate holder, it had to come off the op specs. You will see that we have, the airplane immediately had to come off the op specs. And this raised quite a few issues with our folks in AFS 300, some of the owners and some of the operators. We came up with what we think is a suitable alternative to that. We'll talk about that as we go through the op specs. We want to make it clear that any time the aircraft's airworthiness is in question, actions have to take place. You have to know exactly what's taking place. Anyway, as you can see, the pilot takes on more and more role as the agent. The more remote, the more distant the operator has, in this case, the operator has no contact with the pilot after takeoff. This will pose difficult, significant problems for inspectors to try to ascertain in their system, the operator's system of operational control, how do they know what's going to take place before it happens with that pilot? Some of this, again, obviously procedures, guidelines established for the pilot. Pilot understands I can't take off if after 8 o'clock at night. I can't do this if the airplane doesn't meet this requirement, so forth and so on. He goes on to say here that obviously once the aircraft departs, there's no contact possible with the pilot. Clearly the operator sets hard parameters for the conduct of the flight. He used the example, I believe in this case, this float plane could not operate at night, and so it is clear that the operator imparts to the pilot, don't come back if you will arrive after sunset. You have to spend the night and then come back in the morning. Obviously, training and knowledge of the local weather phenomena is important. The question is, how much, again, do you know? How much do you impart to that agent? Because ultimately, the certificate holder is going to be responsible for the actions or inactions of their agents, in this case, the pilot. So, as that note says down there, the pilot may be authorized to act as an agent for the carrier in all aspects after departure. True. Of course, we see this spelled out in the manual. Carrier must set up all the parameters to be able to anticipate the actions of the pilot away from the base. I asked a director of operations about this. I had the opportunity to go to Muscle Shoals, Alabama, talk to some folks. I asked the director of operations, I said, do you know what a pilot's going to do before they do it? He looked at me to the sense that, what do you think, I'm a mind reader? And I said, I'll bet you can tell me how the pilot will start the engines on the airplane. I bet you'll tell me what approaches the pilot may or may not fly. I bet you can tell me how long the pilot has been on duty. I bet you there's a lot of things you can tell me about the pilot before he or she actually operates the aircraft. In that case, I think it was this idea, oh, that's you're getting at this idea that I should have knowledge of before something happens. Not necessarily just a faxed piece of paper after something took place. The EMS helicopter pilot. This poses a significant, I believe, a significant problem for inspectors, operators alike. Because now, clearly the operator assigns the pilot of the aircraft to a base, a hospital, say. But they don't know until the call comes in whether or not they're going to fly. So they have no expectation of a flight. In the other examples, obviously demands were put upon the operator. The operator said, yes, we can do it. And they make the assignments, they assign the aircraft, they know the airworthiness of the status of the aircraft. Flight takes place. In the EMS kind of operation, we don't really know what's going to take place. This, as I said, poses significant issues since a flight may or may not take place. So now flight and rest, aircraft maintenance times, become important because now these parameters have to be put in place. The pilot must know these and say, after this period of time, you may not operate. The aircraft may not operate if there is a certain maintenance requirement or time or limitation. It may not operate past this time. And that information has to be imparted to the pilot, and it must be clear that the pilot understands that requirement. You'll see that requirement in the aspects. That the pilot must understand who's controlling the flight, what kind of rules the flight is being conducted under, and who is actually, all the requirements or limitations for that flight. So in this case, the operator provides the pilot with some hard parameters. As I said, it gives a duty day, maximum number of hours, flight hours the pilot can fly, maximum number of hours the aircraft can fly, and also starts to impart landing zone requirements and weather requirements. This is, again, another significant safety area that I have seen. I'm not a EMS expert, but I have clearly seen areas where this needs significant improvement, because I believe that these areas are actually being determined by the pilot command, and that management has no idea what is taking place here. Or worse, an unqualified person, such as a hospital dispatcher, or whatever you want to call them, is actually controlling the flight. And that the pilot now, I think Cooper calls it the Stockholm Syndrome, actually believes that he or she is working for that hospital, and is willing to take on flights outside of the parameters that have been established by the certificate holder, both in landing zone requirements and weather requirements as such, and now is operating, could be operating contrary to just safe operating procedures and regulations. Somebody else didn't turn off their phone either. The schedule shifting, again, the example is initiation, conduct, and termination of the flight. You have the area of operations or type of operations, all whether that's all driven by op specs. They're applied by the operator in making shift assignments. The operator assigns the pilots on the aircraft to a duty period, once again setting all the parameters for the operation, and applies the op specs, company procedures in planning the flights, lets the pilot know this, pilot understands what the requirements are. Even though the pilot, once again, becomes responsible for the return or possible diversion of the flight, the carrier, it is done within the parameters of the carrier's procedures. Of course, pilot reports once the aircraft has landed, hopefully safety or diversion has taken place. Again, the pilot and the operator may have no knowledge of the customer's request, meaning they don't know if the flight's going to take place or not. Rather, they're